Today, I'd specifically like to address the private sector draft from Delegate Maldonado. Chamber of Progress strongly supports efforts to combat bias in all forms, whether they are human-based or algorithmic-based. And I'd like to thank Delegate Maldonado in particular, as well as Chair Eben, for taking this issue offline with us and discussing our concerns. That said, we strongly urge the subcommittee to consider taking a sector-by-sector approach to address bias instead of a one-size-fits-all approach in one bill. Virginia has existing policies on anti-bias and anti-discrimination, and those can and should be strengthened. And a sector-by-sector approach would clarify that discrimination is a problem, whether it occurs offline or online. Turning to this draft language in particular, I'd like to flag a few provisions of concern for us. We are very concerned with the addition of the opt-out provision in HB 747. That was not in the original bill, and I'd be happy to provide in writing the direct placement of the new language in the bill. In short, that provision of requiring an opt-out option for consumers is just not practical policy. In practice, it would require every single deployer to implement two separate decision-making processes, and in doing so, it would cost deployers significant resources and would actually undermine the purpose of using AI in decision-making in the first place, which is obviously to cut time and resources and make decisions on an equal basis. It's for these reasons that no other state has implemented an opt-out provision. We would also like to caution that further in both bills, but specifically again for the private sector, duty of care is not defined in the draft language, and this can be tricky legally. There have been a range of legal interpretations for duty of care, so we caution consideration when you decide, if you decide to define that. I'll leave it there for today, and we will provide our comments in writing. But again, thank you to the chair and delegate for engaging with us, and we look forward to continue working. And Mr. Chair, as a native Baltimorean, I appreciated your John Walters example earlier, so thank you.
Okay. Before I turn it over to Senator Aird, I did want to ask you, in terms of duty of care, is there another state that has a definition that you like?
I can get back to you with examples of stronger definitions, but in general, there's been a mixed result in judicial considerations.
I know that Delegate Maldonado would appreciate, and I would appreciate that clarity.
Absolutely.
And then Senator Aird has a question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Not to speak to Delegate Maldonado, I know she will address this, but for all the opt-out concerns, she has shared that she does have a way to address the opt-out mechanism. But Mr. Chair, my question is regarding the reference you made to existing discriminatory language in the Virginia Code. And so I just wanted to clarify, by my reading, I didn't see anything specifically to algorithmic bias. By your interpretation, would that existing language also cover that?
Existing language in Virginia Code would not necessarily cover AI, as it's an emerging new technology. So our preference is always to take a sector-by-sector approach. Different sectors have different consideration when it comes to anti-bias and anti-discrimination. You wouldn't treat, for example, labor and workplace discrimination and anti-discrimination measures the same as education necessarily. And there are different uses for AI in each sector. And so we believe that by taking the sector-by-sector approach, you can more specifically parse out what anti-bias looks like.
Mr. Chairman, and so based on the definition that we're using right now, we do sort of, I think, offer a very long list of categories that could fall into that. Do you think that leaves out any sector that you are currently referenced that should be further specified when the way it's structured right now?
The categories that you've listed are comprehensive, and they follow existing language in other international models, in fact. Our stance is really about the approach in one large bill instead of looking at each sector and seeing what infrastructure is already in existence that we can incorporate emerging technologies into instead of an overall omnibus approach.
Mr. Chairman, final question. Is there another example you can point me to of who structures their discriminatory language in a sector-by-sector format?
I mean, Virginia has existing anti-discrimination language in all of the sectors that you mentioned in the bill. And so we're just suggesting that you work more closely with those different sectors instead of an overall approach.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, if I could just ask, so are you suggesting then, it's Ms. January?
Yes.
Ms. January, are you suggesting that we perhaps take the Virginia Human Rights Act or the Virginia Values Act, and where it says you won't discriminate on the basis of these different items in these categories, you would specify algorithmic bias in that part of the code?
More so the implementation of those acts, so how those acts are implemented in the Department of Education, for example, or the Department of Labor and labor practices, and look at how AI fits into those
Okay.
specific uses.
Well, thank you for that, for those comments.